Hello, everybody, and welcome to the last step of this journey into psychoanalysis. I hope you have enjoyed it so far. At the end of this episode, I will add some personal conclusions to what we talked about up until now, delineating some take home messages that I extrapolated from this book. Not all the points discussed find my complete agreement, of course, so I want to give you an idea of how I integrate this knowledge and points of view in my approach. So let's start with the last two arguments. Firstly, we will see how the desire does not follow the rules of well-being that we always assumed as reasonable. By this point, we should have sort of understood this already. Here we will see a bit more of the game we mentioned last time while talking about the death drive to try to grasp its meaning more deeply. Then we will conclude with a beautiful eulogy of ignorance. It might sound strange right now, but it will make a lot more sense when we will get there. So, the premise is the same. It's better to enjoy than to live. And here I have to clarify something. The word godere is untranslatable in its literal meaning in English. It's the word used to express the enjoyment that derives from sex, but not exclusively. Its meaning is much more carnal and instinctual than the word enjoy. So keep that in mind when I say it's better to enjoy than to live. The bulimic patient, for example, pursues the pleasure of exploding when eating and not the one of eating itself. There is almost a macabre impulse behind many of these patterns. But once we know that, the goal should not be to erase or deny these dark impulses. This excess, this controversy, can be made virtuous with the analytical process, and first of all, with the recognition of its existence. Let's go back to Freud's grandson's game, mentioned last time. Left alone by his mother, he plays a game with a spool. First, he moves the spool away from himself, saying the German word fort, away. Then, he makes a comeback with the word da, here. It's a famous game in the psychoanalytical environment, and Lacan and Winnicott mentioned it too. What they highlighted about it is its symbolic purpose. The object becomes a chance to transform a loss into a gain. The object is leaving, and I make it come back, from a passive event to an active one. But Recalcati thinks there's something missing in this interpretation, namely the joy of losing. The whole focus for him is not on the moment of reconnection, of active control. On the contrary, it's the fort that creates a much more obscene pleasure. It's throwing away the object that's the ultimate desire. With this affirmation, we move towards some interesting implications. There is a slim boundary between throwing ourselves into a project and throwing ourselves away. With inspiration, desire, creation, we expose ourselves. We stop working for our own well-being and pursue potentially harmful things. The protection of our identity and boundaries loses its importance when following our desire. If there is a da, that is still not the goal. That is not guaranteed. The fort is what matters for our desire. Throwing the object away is throwing ourselves away with it. Let's move to the last argument then, with just one premise. Knowing our unconscious means becoming what we know. It's a self-constructing process that discovers itself and that has no ideal destination. First, because the unconscious traces this road itself. And second, learning does not have an ideal destination. Educators should not fill students with contents with the aim of having a complete fact-based measurable knowledge. Educators teach ignorance, or at least they should. Lay, used by Freud in his book The Question of Lay Analysis, does not only mean like, but comes from the same root as ignorant. In this case, we mean ignorant of dogmatic procedures, ignorant of rigid assertions, ignorant of what we assume we know, with the implicit assumption of not having to learn any more about it. It's not ignorance in the most common use, it's not ignoring knowledge, but ignoring the knowledge we assume we have already. In a sense, starting over again. The propeller of analysis is this exact ignorance towards the desire, wanting to discover something we assume we know about ourselves. The wonderful conclusion is that there are no solid certainties in the approach of an analyst. He always has to be a bit late in comprehension, asks to repeat, to say again, to clarify. He has to leave the anticipatory intuitions behind, the schemes, and be only motivated by doubt and curiosity. It's a coherent conclusion to this project to emphasize the importance of a non-directive attitude towards the patient. what we saw before about not being the expert, the doctor that heals, fixes, instructs, but merely the means with which our patient can access his or her own unconscious reality. It's an important focus on the attitude rather than the prescription. And this leads me to a more personal comment on the topics we touched in these 6 weeks. Up until this point, I've tried to report the arguments as literally as possible, according to Recalcati's message, or at least I thought I was as literal as possible. Forgive me, Massimo, if I've misunderstood some of your messages, but it was inevitable to add some of my experience. So let's summarize some important key points of this series. First, and most important, symptoms are meaningful. It's a simplification to sustain that we only want good things and that bad or unexpected things that happen to us are an error to get rid of. There is more below the surface. There are more desires beyond the ones that we see and identify with. And symptoms can be precious in increasing our knowledge of ourselves. Second, defense is not inherently good. An extreme defense can become an attack in itself. Like in autoimmune diseases, extreme protection can lead to destruction. Strict boundaries prevent a fruitful contamination with the diverse. And this is not only relevant in psychoanalysis or therapy, it's a vital message, now more than ever, for society, for communities. Now that the fear of the differences leads us to build walls, to leave ships in the sea, to keep people out, to define what's us and what's them, what's right and what's wrong, it's essential to remember what the risks of such defenses are. Strengthening the I means weakening the we, and with it, the chance of sharing, contamination, blending. In the year where we had to learn to keep distance, see the other as potential danger, it's important to remember instead how to keep contaminating each other from a distance, how to foster connection and permeability. Third, ambivalence can and has to become an important theme within the therapeutic process. It's the resolution of a dichotomy, the same dichotomy we saw at the beginning between rational and emotional, that leads to a strict division, a lack of integration, a simplistic view of existence that is not interested nor needed when we talk about human beings. Ambivalence between our desire and our social needs, both essential to us, impossible to reduce to a victory of one over the other. And regarding this theme, I want to mention that ambivalence is also the theme that I chose for this month in my social medias. And you can follow me with the links that you'll find at the end of this presentation to join the discussion. Fourth, what does the unconscious teach us if not that the control is an illusion? The fact that some of our strongest and deepest needs are not coherent with the image we carefully build of ourselves day after day, year after year, should teach us a form of humility necessary to learn those things, to explore them as if they are not granted, decided. It's a basic human need to feel a certain degree of control over things that happen around, let alone inside oneself. But it should be an important part of growth and adulthood to accept uncontrollability and not surrender to it. This precious balance between an admission of instinctuality and an acceptance of responsibility for what we do with that desire is the message underlying each one of these arguments. It's really the premise that allows the discourse. Extremes are easier, but they are just an attempt to explain complex things. We have to learn a way to stay inside confusion, ambivalence, conflict. That yields to creation and change. Fifth, dreams require responsibility. As we saw, we are always this close to falling in the trap of dreams as alibis, of instincts and desires as excuses of our antisocial behaviors, of our inability to control ourselves, as if guided by an external, uncontrollable force. This is only true if we decide to ignore their existence, just to let it burst out at times when it's too repressed. And even in this case, it's a decision. Remember when you became 18 and they told you that now you wouldn't have the right to be ignorant anymore? That it would be assumed that you know how to behave even if you don't, and you could still be punished for it? Well, this is the message of the unconscious. You can decide to ignore it, but it's still a decision, and that still makes it your responsibility. Sixth, being impure is necessary. Only the impure can feel gratitude and forgiveness because they have accepted the impurity within themselves. A therapeutic process, in my opinion, should not work with the premise of purity, of perfection, of liberation, but on the assumption that we are imperfect, flawed beings, and that the aim is not to smooth the roughness, file the edges, transform us into hyper-functional, pleasing beings. The uniqueness dwells inside the roughness, and recognizing it in ourselves, not suppressing it, allows us to recognize it and accept it in others too. 7. The importance of no. The condition for expression is limit. Making our own rules is only possible when we have rules to start with. And again, this message is generalizable to the education system, whether that is within the family or at school. Education passes by limits. 8. The real is not the reality. The real hits us when something breaks that opaque patina of reality we construct together with the society around us. An Italian author called this concept the tear in the sky of paper. In a book called One, No One, 100,000, a guy called Vitangelo looks in the mirror and his wife asks if he is looking at how his nose leans on the left. He is shocked by it, as he had never noticed it. His perception is irreversibly changed, his identity inevitably doubted. That is what happens when the real penetrates reality. That is waking up, and we need to be awake to live a meaningful life. 9. There is a pleasure in throwing away and throwing ourselves away. Almost like an extracorporeal experience where we lose our attachment to survival and we just exist, non-mindful of preserving ourselves and our identity. A cathartic experience of leaving behind, a liberation. If I can attempt a simplification here, a personal interpretation of this concept, our life is full of objects, of things to keep in mind, of appointments, of constructions, of structures, of people, events, rules to be mindful of. In other words, the reality. It's like leaving the phone at home and having to face the anguish for a second before we feel liberated. It's something less to worry about, something less that belongs to us and defines us and imposes us responsibilities and decisions. These were the points I extrapolated from this series and the ones I feel more in line with my approach. I integrate them in my work as a psychologist and I think about them quite often, I have to say. They don't describe a method, but a direction, and it's the direction that my professional journey takes. More generally, there is a confrontation with death and suffering that is necessary when we talk about therapy. The assumption of healing everything, or that everything can lead to good, and if it doesn't, it can be fixed, is more a defense, an illusion, than a reality. It's a simplification to assume that we only want good things, and it's naivety to think that we deserve the best. That does not mean that our life should be miserable, but we have to come to terms with the complexity of existence filled with good and bad things, and in some forms unsolvable. I hope this personal contribution gave you the chance to reflect with me on these concepts, and my biggest hope is always that a message can yield an exponential number of conversations, debates, discussions. So if you'll ask someone in the next days, do you think we should understand symptoms or just get rid of them? I will consider the goal of this project to be fully attained. I want to thank you all for listening and leave you with the message that was the most important for me while I was reading the book. I want to know what in me feeds my disasters. Thank you so much.